Okay, we're going to work with adding and subtracting rational expressions with unlike denominators now. So let's talk about how to find a common denominator first. This is the same thing when you were in elementary school. If you had 2/3 and you were trying to add 2/3 to 1/5, then you had to get your common denominator. And in this case, your least common denominator would be 15, okay, because 3 goes into 15 and so does 5. And then you had to rewrite those fractions. So you had to take 3 and say, okay, well, what would I have to multiply by to get the 15? And it was times 5. So then you multiplied the numerator times 5, and that would give you 10. And then same thing for your second fraction. You asked yourself, okay, what would I multiply times? And in this case, it was times 3, because 5 times 3 is 15. And so then 1 times 3 is 3. So that would give you 13 over 15. And then you tried to simplify if you could. Okay, well, we are going to be working with polynomial fractions. And with our polynomial fractions, it's the same thing. It's just this time we're going to have polynomials. Okay, so let's look at an easy one to start with. So I have 3 over 10x squared plus 7 over 15x. Okay, so our numbers, the numerical part of it, you guys probably won't have any trouble with. You're trying to find a common denominator between 10 and 15. And if you're not sure how to do that, you can use that upside down division that I think I've talked about before, and start with something that you know goes into both of them. So in this case, it would be 5, and 5 goes into 10 2 times, and 5 goes into 15 3 times. So the common denominator, the least common denominator, makes this L right here, and you multiply those together, and that'll give you your least common denominator, the numerical part. And so for that numerical part, it would be 5 times 2 times 3, which is 30. So I know I'm going to need a 30. And now let's look at the variables. So if we go through our steps, there are some steps we can take for the variables, okay? So what we want to do is we need to list the factors of the first denominator. So in this case, the factors of the first denominator, don't worry about our number part because we can get our number part. So we see an x squared in our first denominator. And so then we will list the factors of our second, my pen's not cooperating, of our second denominator. Okay, so the factors of our second denominator in this case, we just have an x because we already took care of the number part, okay? So then from there, what we're going to do is just look at the factors, and we know that the only base that we see is an x. So in our common denominator, we're going to need an x, and even though, kind of like we've talked about this before, I know I'm going to need an x. This is least common denominator, but I need the factor that appears the most times. So if you notice, this is just a plain x, and this is an x to the second, and so our common denominator is going to have a second power on that x because we need the most of any time that the factor appeared. Okay, so this is what I told my daughter when she was trying to figure out how to do this before, and it was driving her crazy. I told her she needed sum of everybody. Okay, so that means that you look at all the factors. In this case, the only factor I have is an x. The problems are going to change, okay? But in this one, I only have x's. So you need sum of everybody. So I know I need an x, but I need the most of anybody. So that means for each of those factors, I need the one that appears the most times. So if I have an x to the fourth and an x to the second, then my common denominator would have an x to the fourth because it would be the highest of the powers. Okay, so let's come back over here and start working on our problem. We've got our common denominator. We know it's 30x squared. So right here, I'm going to have to rewrite both of my fractions using that common denominator, 30x squared. So then I ask myself, okay, oops, sorry about that. I ask myself, okay, what would I have to multiply by to get this 30x squared? Well, I need a 3 because 10 times 3 is 30. I started off with an x squared. I ended up with an x squared. I don't need any more x. So 3 times 3 is 9. So my new numerator for my first fraction is 9. So I do the same thing on the other side. I'd have to multiply times something to get down to this 30x squared. Well, I know 15 times 2 is 30. And I started with an x, but I ended with an x squared. So I'll need a 2x to end up with that x squared. So I multiply my numerator times 2x, and that will give me a new numerator, and my new numerator would be 14x. Okay, so now I can add those fractions together since they have a common denominator, and my common denominator is 30x squared. So I'll add 9 plus 14x. Okay, 9 plus 14x. And then I'll check to see if I can factor anything. The numerator, 9 and 14, there's nothing in common. The x's won't cancel out. Remember, that's part of a family up there, 9 plus 14x, so you can't just cancel people out. So my final answer would be 9 plus 14x over 30x squared. Now, don't freak out if you look in your answers and you see 14x plus 9 over 30x squared, okay? That's fine. That's the same answer. As long as your signs are all the same, then you get the same answer. So either of those would be correct. Okay, so remember, for your common denominator, you need sum of everybody, but the most of anybody. Okay, so let's try another one. Let me see. I'm going to leave my sum of everybody, but the most of anybody over there. Okay, and let's see if we can get another one going. I want to leave my listing my factors so we know what we're doing. Okay, so let's try x over x minus 3 plus x minus 1 over x plus 3. Okay, so my first step is to find my common denominator. So my factors from my first denominator, it's x minus 3. It's a binomial factor. My factor from my second denominator is x plus 3. And so I need sum of everybody but most of anybody. So the factors that I see are x minus 3 and x plus 3. There are no powers, and they're not the same factors, so that means I need each of those as my common denominator. So my common denominator is going to be x minus 3. My pen's just acting crazy. Times x plus 3. Okay, so I have to rewrite this problem using my common denominator. X minus 3 times x plus 3. Okay, so just like before, you have to ask yourself, what would I have to multiply by? What would I have to multiply by to get to this new denominator? The x minus 3 is already there, so I will need to multiply times an x plus 3. Okay, so my new numerator is going to be x times x plus 3. And then on the other side, I do the same thing. What would I multiply by to get to my new denominator? Well, I started with an x plus 3, and I need that x minus 3 right there, so I'd have to multiply times an x minus 3. So my new numerator here would be x minus 1 times x minus 3. Okay, x minus 1 times x minus 3. Okay, so now I just got to do a little bit of work and cleaning up because I can't add those right now because they're factored out, and ultimately I have to be able to add the numerators. I want to leave my denominators in factored form. That's going to be best for me until the very end. So let's keep them in factored form. And what we will do is we will go ahead and distribute for our numerators. So my first numerator, I would distribute the x, and that's going to give me x squared plus 3x. And for my second one, I'll FOIL it, okay? So my first, that's x squared. My outside, that's minus 3x. My inside's minus 1x. And my last plus 3. Okay, so now I'm going to simplify a little bit. So I'll have my first fraction, x squared plus 3x over, I'm going to just write LCD for this time, okay? So I don't have to write all out. And then over here, I have x squared minus 4x plus 3 over my LCD. Okay, so now I'm ready to go ahead and add. So my LCD is going to stay the same. I get x squared plus 3x plus x squared minus 4x plus 3. Okay, and then I want to add or put together my like terms. So I have 2x squareds in there. I'll be combining those. And then I have 2 x's in there. I'll be combining those. Okay, so combining my like terms, I'll get 2x squared minus x plus 3. And that will be over my common denominator. And I'm going to write it out this time. Okay, x minus 3 times x plus 3. Okay, so my next step, I have to decide, well, will that numerator of 2x squared minus x plus 3, will it factor? And if it will factor, then I would have one more step. I'd have to factor it and then look for things in common. But I've tried over here. I know that it would be a negative, okay? And so I worked on it for a little while, minus x plus 3. And I could not find 2 factors that would work. You know, I had to have my 1 and my 2. I had to have my 3 and my 1. And there was no getting around it. It didn't work. So this was prime. I tried and tried and tried. So that means that I'm done. And so this would be my final answer. 2x squared minus x plus 3 over x plus 3.